Last month, South African President Jacob Zuma was forced from office after a decade of fraud and corruption allegations. His former associates, the billionaire Gupta brothers, are fugitives from justice amid claims that they looted state assets. Now others are under scrutiny. We've been to examine the role played by international companies in a scandal so toxic it'll haunt South Africa for years to come.
In 2009, Jacob Zuma came to power, having sold himself to South Africa as the people's president. He'd promised to grow the economy, fight poverty, and create millions of jobs. 9 years later, and it hasn't ended well. Last month, Zuma, amidst growing corruption allegations, stepped down as South Africa's president, forced out by his own governing African National Congress, the liberation party that had fought apartheid and won.
I have therefore come to the decision to resign as President of the Republic with immediate effect.
His links to an influential billionaire business family, the Guptas, were revealed last year in a massive Paradise Papers-style data leak. The Gupta leaks appear to reveal how these three brothers, AJ, Atul and Rajesh, who are friends with former President Jacob Zuma and in business with one of his sons, set up a vast network of patronage, offering monetary rewards in return for political loyalty to Zuma. So how entrenched is corruption in South Africa? We asked someone who'd know, a businessman who pays bribes to win government tenders. He spoke to us on condition we hid his identity.
There's an expectation that they need to get something in return for them giving you a tender. I just think it's systemic.
That bribe is then transferred to an intermediary.
Then the intermediary company either transfers it to another company who then transfers it to the corrupt official, or it's transferred offshore into a trust. Offshore, your name's not in the fore at all.
In some parts of the country, corruption is so embedded, it's now become a deadly business. In KwaZulu-Natal, for example, Zuma's home province, there have been over 200 politically motivated killings in the last 4 years. Makosi Khoza, a former ANC politician, left the party last year in protest at corruption within its ranks. She's been targeted ever since.
I was receiving death threats on a daily basis, and my children were receiving death threats as well.
The killings, she says, are mainly due to turf wars between corrupt local ANC politicians. Last year, a video of two heavily armed ANC bodyguards was shared widely on social media. She knows these men well. They worked for a former ANC colleague.
Those are his bodyguards. That culture of violence is there, and if people can do a video like that, it goes to tell you what kind of people are you dealing with. This is about the politics of patronage. It's all linked to tenders. It's all linked to who is controlling what state resources.
The Zuma years presented opportunities to businesses to make lots of money, fast. Some of those opportunities seem to have been irresistible even to multinational companies, who should have known better. To date, the Gupta leak scandal has implicated law firms, software companies, banks, management consultants, major accountancy practices, and public relations companies. More disturbing still, the spotlight has fallen on auditors, firms whose statutory role is to keep their clients honest by maintaining independent oversight of their businesses. Much of the attention has fallen on KPMG, one of the so-called Big Four international audit firms. It was the Gupta's personal and business auditor for 16 years. Now it's embroiled in several scandals regarding its work in South Africa. The first is over a report it produced for the South African Revenue Service. Tom Moyane, the head of SARS as it's known, unleashed this bombshell report publicly in August 2015. It contained, he claimed, damning evidence that an elite crime-fighting unit within SARS was operating unlawfully. For almost 8 months prior to this, a national newspaper, the Sunday Times, had been running exposés almost weekly about a rogue unit operating from within the service. The detailed 157-page KPMG report took 30 people a year to produce, at a cost of 23 million rand. It appeared to validate the rogue unit stories and implicated senior SARS officials in unlawful activities such as spying on the National Prosecuting Authority and misleading the Public Protector and State Security Agency about its existence. One of those at the centre of the allegations was Johan van Lockerenberg. He took over the unit in 2008. It was set up in 2007 to tackle organised crime syndicates. He spoke exclusively to people in power.
The last time I counted, I think there was something like 82 singular allegations of some kind of offence, ranging from breaking into President Zuma's private residence and planting listening devices there, down to murdering people and everything else in between. It's extremely humiliating to have to read about yourself in the newspaper on the front page, being associated with findings attributed to a reputable company, or what I thought to be a reputable company, like KPMG, who basically make me out to have been a criminal.
The report also implicated then Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan, who'd previously headed SARS, saying he ought to have known of the existence of the unit. This was later used as one of President Zuma's motivations for firing Gordhan as Finance Minister in March 2017.
And so a whole process of about 9 months of harassment from questions from the special police unit called the Hawks, the threat of prosecutions and charges being laid, none of which, of course, materialized. It merely angered the business community and the public more generally.
Anger them it did. In a series of public protests, South Africans rallied behind Gordhan. Problem is that KPMG have since said their report couldn't be relied upon. Following revelations in the Gupta leaks of KPMG South Africa's involvement with Gupta-linked businesses, KPMG International investigated. In September 2017, it withdrew the conclusions of its own report. KPMG also took the extraordinary step of replacing its South African CEO and his senior management team. They've also paid back the 23 million rand they charged SARS for the report. Despite these measures, many questions remain unanswered. For example, which, if any, of the specific allegations contained in the report were actually true? We requested an interview with KPMG, but they declined. In a written response, they restated that the report's conclusions, recommendations, and legal opinions should no longer be relied upon. But the damage the report has caused will be felt for years to come, says one of South Africa's leading economists, Iraj Abedian.
On a narrow revenue collection impact, this year SARS reported a shortfall of about 50 billion rand. You have central government now short of revenues. That means borrowing more. That means running into international creditworthiness problems, or if you like, being downgraded.
We asked to interview Mr. Moyane to discuss these allegations, but SARS didn't respond. Since 2014, under his leadership, 55 senior staff and 500 others have quit.
Great friendships were broken. People got divorced. Children were affected as a result of this.
Also, the independence of the investigation has been called into question over a fundamental issue.
Nobody who is implicated or named in those reports as being, inverted commas, guilty of one thing or another was ever asked to put their point of view.
At first, van Lockerenberg welcomed the KPMG investigation.
I envisaged a process whereby KPMG, their lawyers, and myself sat down in a room behind closed doors, for once being honest and open and frank, going through the report line by line.
But KPMG declined to sit down with him. And then, in September 2015, a draft of the report was leaked to the media.
I received a text message from a journalist from the Sunday Times. Please, can I comment? You know, how do you comment on a report that you haven't seen? KPMG should have immediately acted on that leak. They should have realized that there was something sinister at play.
Clearly, Mr. Moyane was put in place as the head of SARS to essentially start a cleanup process which would take out the excellent senior management that we had put in place.
So he began to, for example, attack a particular unit that was tracking illicit financial flows, because they had already compiled the file on the Guptas, they had filed on President Zuma and his family, and a whole lot of other politically connected actual and fake businesses.
And when I looked at that report, I mean, I was shocked. As far as I'm concerned, it's pure hocus pocus. It contains absolute material misstatements. It even contains, as far as I'm concerned, fraudulent statements.
The report, Van Lochenberg says, contained scant evidence, but implied that he was complicit in serious wrongdoing. This, he believes, fueled Sunday Times articles alleging he was involved in many misdeeds, including spying on the president, running a brothel, and unlawfully operating a secret 500 million rand fund. The Sunday Times was later to retract its stories about a rogue unit, which the press ombudsman labelled as inaccurate, misleading, and unfair. It also apologised to Gordhan, Van Lochenberg, and former Deputy SARS Commissioner Ivan Pillay. After the leak, Van Lochenberg tried again to get KPMG to review his counter-evidence in order to restore his reputation.
At that point, they suddenly said to me that they had contracted with the Revenue Service not to engage with me.
In a written response as to why it refused to hear the testimony of those implicated, KPMG said no comment.
The impact of the KPMG's role in the Revenue Service is a massive one. Our own fiscal sovereignty, in other words, our ability to run government finances largely on the basis of taxes collected within South Africa, has been seriously undermined.
In yet another extraordinary twist to the saga, as this film was being prepared for broadcast, Van Lochenberg, Pillay, and another former SARS official were summoned to appear in court on the 9th of April 2018. They're facing corruption and other charges brought by the Hawks Investigative Unit. Bizarrely, these charges are based on the contents of the now discredited KPMG report. All three strenuously deny the allegations and have asked South Africa's National Prosecuting Authority to withdraw the charges. Another KPMG scandal involved South Africa's most notorious wedding. In 2013, the Gupta staged 4 days of opulent nuptials for their niece at Sun City, a well-known casino resort. Attendees included Bollywood stars, cabinet ministers, and captains of industry. Also invited were the Gupta's auditors, KPMG. Afterwards, KPMG's then chief executive emailed Atul Gupta, thanking him for the event of the millennium. The company has since acknowledged it was a mistake to have attended. But that might not have been KPMG's only mistake. As a consortium of local investigative journalists discovered, the tab for the event of the millennium, which cost 30 million rand, was actually picked up by South African taxpayers. This Gupta-linked dairy farm allegedly stole hundreds of millions of rand of government money, which was supposed to be used to empower 100 poor black farmers.
Increasingly, the Gupta and this network of extraction needed advice as to how to structure different operations. For example, they stole close on 250 million from a dairy project. 30 million of it had to go to Dubai and round trip back here to pay for a wedding.
KPMG weren't the farm's auditors, but they did audit the books of Linkway, the company which laundered the wedding money back into South Africa. This was billed as a business expense, thereby avoiding the stolen money from being taxed. Obedient questions are KPMG, the Gupta's auditors, could have missed this.
KPMG had to advise them how to do it in South Africa, how to do it in Dubai. So they used their international network, KPMG's international advisory services in Dubai, to help them set it up in full compliance with the Dubai legislation.
A junior KPMG auditor flagged the Linkway payments, saying these costs are most probably not in the production of the company's income. Despite this, KPMG signed off on Linkway's financials. So who then audits the auditors? That question is deeply concerning to UK politician Lord Peter Hain.
My Lords, there have been no criminal prosecutions for money laundering of financial institutions and very few of other enablers such as lawyers or accountants.
A former anti-apartheid activist, he's presently campaigning for UK authorities to act against companies who, he says, were complicit in South African corruption.
There have been regulatory fines, but it is not clear that these are enough to deter banks and other financial players from making their anti-money laundering compliance regimes a tick-boxing exercise rather than a meaningful one.
But it's not just auditors who've been caught up in South Africa's Gupta scandals. Another murky episode involves US-based management consultancy McKinsey and work it did for Eskom, South Africa's state-owned electricity provider. In January 2016, Eskom signed a lucrative consultancy agreement with McKinsey to help it increase revenue and streamline operations. A key condition of the deal was that McKinsey would partner with the local black-owned company. Controversially, it planned to partner with Trillion, a firm which, it later turned out, was linked to the politically well-connected Gupta brothers. 6 months later, after questions were raised about Trillion's role in the deal and the amounts McKinsey was paid, Eskom cancelled the project. In that short time, McKinsey and Trillion earned 1.6 billion rand between them. Corruption Watch South Africa has now approached US authorities to investigate McKinsey. The NGO alleges that the US-based consultancy used Trillion and its Gupta connections to secure the lucrative Eskom contract in return for a massive kickback to Trillion of 580 million rand.
It needed McKinsey to be colluding with Trillion. Eskom would not have been willing to enter into a contract, and many of their senior executives advised against it. But then the political connections of Trillion, of course, kicked in, and that's how the contract was secured.
McKinsey strongly refutes these accusations. We requested an interview with the firm to clarify matters, but it declined. In statements, it told us it never had a formal partnership with Trillion, and it's denied serving Gupta-linked companies or making payments to secure contracts. But Bianca Goodson, Trillion's former CEO, questions McKinsey's version of events.
The first meeting I had with McKinsey, particularly on the generation team, that they showed me an organogram of what they proposed the delivery team should look like.
The generation team was tasked with boosting the efficiency of several Eskom power stations. According to her, McKinsey behaved as though it didn't want or need Trillion to do any meaningful work.
And there were no Trillion people, and I questioned that. And I was like, okay, well, where's Trillion's representation? And they were actually like taken aback. They were like, but you won't be doing anything.
Disturbed at how McKinsey and Trillion were conducting the Eskom deal, she resigned after just 3 months. Later, she turned whistleblower and gave evidence about the affair to a parliamentary inquiry investigating corruption. Goodson had been pushing to get more Trillion staff onto the generation team.
Eventually, by the time I resigned, Trillion had 3 people on the generation workstream. The generation workstream was supposed to produce R1 billion over 3 years for just one power station. For 3 people working. Can you imagine what the margins are? I mean, knowing what an average salary is for some of those people, it's insane.
She says Trillion's relationship with Eskom was so strong that she was able to pen a draft letter to McKinsey on the instruction of a senior Eskom executive. It spelled out that the supply development partner is Trillion.
Trillion enabled McKinsey to get the work. Explicitly is what Clive had told me. The relationships with Eskom did not reside with McKinsey, they resided with Trillion. And this is why Salim would also take the approach of that if McKinsey were being too difficult, they could leave and we'd get paid because the relationships existed with us.
Clive and Salim were her bosses, and Salim is Salim Essa, whose ties to the Guptas are so well known, he's often referred to as the fourth Gupta brother. McKinsey say that Trillion concealed its Gupta connection by not revealing that Salim Essa was its majority shareholder. When it found this out, it terminated its relationship with Trillion. That was in March 2016. But, says Goodson, McKinsey's insistence that it didn't know who it was dealing with is highly implausible. Essa had been interacting with McKinsey via Vikas Sagar, a partner at the firm.
There was a time when Vikas seemingly ignored me, and I escalated it to Clive, and Clive would escalate it to Salim, and it's amazing what attention I would get after that. Because after Salim would intervene, then suddenly McKinsey would be like, okay, Bianca, we've heard you. Sorry we didn't get your emails that you've sent 2 weeks ago. Now we hear you.
Sagar's relationship with Essa dates back to at least 2014. Emails uncovered by local journalists in the Gupta leaks show the two corresponded about work at another state company. And in a private presentation to Eskom, a full 2 months before McKinsey pulled the plug on Trillion, it had already flagged reputational risk through association with partner. At first glance, McKinsey's offering to Eskom seemed tantalizing. It would save the utility tens of billions of rand and would be on a no-fee, at-risk basis. Instead, it would earn a percentage of any savings it created for Eskom. It was to net McKinsey R1 billion in just 6 months. But when Suzanne Daniels, Eskom's head of legal, began reviewing the contract, she discovered concerning details.
The contract was extremely weighted in McKinsey's favor, so all the risk was actually with Eskom.
Other Eskom executives had their doubts as to why the huge public utility needed McKinsey's advice at all.
At certain of our executive committee meetings, the other colleagues were not really convinced that McKinsey did add any value because it was standard operational work that they were doing.
In Parliament, McKinsey stood by its R1 billion fee. David Fine, a senior partner based in London, flew to South Africa to give evidence to the corruption inquiry.
And I'm comfortable with the size of the fee, that Eskom could have actually absorbed this much change, but I have got comfort from my colleagues, at least what they've shown me, and has been independently audited by Oliver Wyman, that was value.
But the Oliver Wyman report, commissioned by Eskom, found that the contract's unusual fee structure resulted in it charging more than double market rates. And McKinsey itself, in its internal presentation to Eskom, flagged exorbitant fees being leaked to media as another risk. Had the contract not been cancelled prematurely, McKinsey and Trillion could have netted almost 10 billion rand, equivalent to more than $800 million for 4 years' work. Suzanne Daniels discovered other irregularities. The contract itself didn't appear to be valid. It didn't identify Trillion as McKinsey's local partner, and no Treasury approval had been sought.
So McKinsey have said, well, they relied upon Eskom to seek the necessary exemptions from the Treasury. But you don't do things that way. You don't say, by the way, did you speak to your friend at the Treasury and is it all cool?
Daniels issued letters of demand to McKinsey and Trillion to repay the money. 48 hours later, she was suspended. That's when the threat started.
Death threats. I've had to increase the security at home, make sure that my family is safe.
In November last year, she also testified at the parliamentary inquiry.
There's only one way to describe this to the people of South Africa. This was brazen theft.
Ending his testimony at the same inquiry, David Fine apologised for mistakes McKinsey had made. He also reiterated that despite the firm's fee being justified, it would pay it back.
Please accept that we will pay the money back to South Africa. We do not want any tainted money.
That offer might now be moot. In January, South Africa's National Prosecuting Authority froze 1.6 billion rand of McKinsey and Trillion assets. It labelled the deal patently corrupt. So, with the Zuma Gupta era now over, and a new president at South Africa's helm, can corruption in the country be brought under control? Gupta thinks it can.
2018 is going to be about rectifying all of that and much more, and demonstrating that South Africa is still Mandela's South Africa.
But the bribe-paying businessman we interviewed isn't so sure.
The president changing may impact high-level corruption, the bigger transactions, the bigger deals. But when it comes to the medium-sized deals, the smaller deals, I think nothing's going to change.
Last week, as this film was being completed, SARS chief Tom Mayani was suspended on the orders of South Africa's new president, Cyril Ramaphosa. Meanwhile, Clive Angel, Bianca Goodson's former colleague, denied being involved in any of the consultancy work which was done as part of the Eskom McKinsey deal.